name is Monica Richardson, and I'm the Senior Managing Editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thank you for joining us here this evening. And thank you to the Atlanta History Center for hosting us today. Also, thank you to our AJC subscribers, Cox Media Group partners, and the Atlanta History Center members for being here this evening. Tonight, we reflect on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There is no better time and no better place to have this conversation. We're gathered here to honor Dr. King. Either you were alive to witness Dr. King in the world, or you have lived these 50 years since his death, or have seen the world change because of his work. It goes without saying that Dr. King is a man worth honoring. And the impact of this moment in history is worth remembering. Personally, I know that I would not be where I am today if it were not for the fight that Dr. King and others have led. Before I introduce our panel, I want to share with you a quick story about how this event came together. I was in my office with three of the AJC's most talented journalists, Leroy Chapman, Richard Hallex, and reporter Ernie Suggs, who helped assemble this panel. I shared with them my vision for marking this moment in time with signature journalism that only the AJC could do, and a signature event. This idea bubbled up as we talked about a way to honor Dr. King, a way to showcase our journalism, and our desire to serve our audiences. I'm certain tonight's panel will stir memories of Dr. King's accomplishments, refresh the focus of his cause, and educate us all on his work. Immediately following our discussion, please stay and join us for an exclusive screening of the WSB-TV Channel 2 special, The Last Days of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This special is actually airing tonight live at 8 p.m., but you will get an exclusive viewing if you'd like to stay for it. As I introduce my panel, I ask that you please hold your applause until the introductions are done. To my immediate right, Zernona Clayton. Zernona Clayton moved to Atlanta in 1965 and started working alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta Scott King, at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She is more than a leader in civil rights. She is also a pioneer in media. While at Turner Broadcasting, Clayton became the first African American in the Southeast to have her own television program. And many of you know her for her work with the Trumpet Awards, recognizing the accomplishments of African Americans in all walks of life. David Garrow. David Garrow is the author of Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. His book is considered the most comprehensive ever written about King. It won the 1987 Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He has been a professor at several universities, including here at Emory University School of Law. Garrow continues to write about the civil rights movement. His latest work is Rising Star, The Making of Barack Obama, published in 2017. Shirley Franklin. Mayor Shirley Franklin's roots in Atlanta run deep, from working with Maynard Jackson to Andrew Young. Franklin was Atlanta's 58th mayor, the first woman to hold this post, and the first African-American woman to be elected mayor of a major southern city. She's still active in making Atlanta a better place, and she serves as executive board chair of Purpose Built Communities Incorporated. Dr. Bernice A. King. Bernice King was only 5 years old when her father was assassinated. She is now Chief Executive Officer of the King Center, which is also in its 50th year. King followed in her father's footsteps as a religious leader, serving at Greater Rising Star Baptist Church and New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. Hank Klibanoff. Hank Klibanoff won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for History for the book he co-authored, The Race Beat, The Press, the Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation. A veteran journalist, he was a reporter and editor for more than 35 years, holding various positions at the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and served as a managing editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Klibanoff is a professor of nonfiction and creative writing program at Emory. He is the host and narrator of Buried Truths, a podcast launching this coming Monday. Buried Truths is a 6-episode narrative that is based on his work as director and teacher of the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project at Emory University. Finally, Ambassador Andrew Young is a pioneer in and champion of civil and human rights. His lifelong dedication to service and leadership spans 65 years, serving as a member of Congress, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mayor of Atlanta, and ordained minister, among other positions. During the 1960s, he was a key strategist and negotiator during the civil rights campaigns that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And finally, moderating tonight's discussion is Kevin Riley, editor of the AJC and my boss. Kevin joined the AJC 7 years ago. He is a longtime employee of Cox Enterprises, which owns the AJC, and he started his career at the Dayton Daily News in Ohio, while a student at the University of Dayton. Riley leads the largest newsroom in the Southeast. Our journalism and our journalists are committed to shedding light on wrongdoing, informing citizens, reporting all sides of complex issues, covering local news, and telling the stories of the people who make Atlanta a better place to live. Now please join me in welcoming our panel and AJC editor, Kevin Riley.
In this job, I get to moderate panels a lot, but wow, what about this panel? It's overwhelming. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to take us back to that day in 1968 and talk about either their recollection or put us back there on the day and its immediate aftermath. I'd like to start with our two journalists to give us a little context within what was going on in the country at that time. So, David, if you want to go first.
In early 1968, Dr. King, as Ambassador Young can testify better than I can, was very committed to mounting a poor people's campaign in Washington, D.C. By early 1968, Dr. King was very concerned and very pessimistic about how America needed to tackle economic inequality. And everyone in SCLC was trying, in large part, to come together to advance this poor people's campaign agenda. When in Memphis, 2 sanitation workers were killed in a garbage truck, that led to a strike by the almost entirely African-American garbage workers in Memphis. One of the black pastors in Memphis, Jim Lawson, was a longtime friend of Dr. King and Ambassador Young. And Reverend Lawson asked Dr. King to come to Memphis to aid the sanitation workers. And Dr. King thought this was a wonderful opportunity to build towards the poor people's campaign. Now, Memphis, as a black community at that time, was riven by a number of divisions, which SCLC ran into. March 28th, 1968, a march led to some degree of violence. 1 young man was killed. That's what brought Dr. King, Ambassador Young, and the others back to Memphis for April 3rd and April 4th. And I'll leave it to Ambassador Young to talk about those particular hours. But it was in this service of a larger calling, a larger challenge against economic inequality, that Dr. King was in Memphis on April 4th.
Well, I know I look that old, but I'm not. I was not a working journalist at the time. I was still in college, as a sophomore in college. And I can almost assure you that my first reaction was, please, God, please tell me this didn't happen in the South. He had been in Cicero. He had run into a lot of problems there. He'd run into a lot of problems in other parts of the country. And I just wanted the South to have risen above something as heinous as that. And of course, it was in the South. And that hurt deeply. Most of what I know about that day is from the research that I've done for the Race Beat and about the news coverage of that day. And, you know, there had been a lot of reporters in town to cover Dr. King and his presentation to the sanitation workers and that momentous speech he gave. And most of them had left town the next day. among those who stayed. And it was because the national editor of the New York Times, a Georgian from Conyers, Claude Sitton, who had covered the civil rights movement like nobody, though I know there are some people who have disputes with him. But he had insisted that never would Dr. King make a move without a New York Times reporter on his trail. And that day, Earl Caldwell, one of the, still at that point, few African Americans who was with a major news organization, was staying at the Lorraine Motel himself. And he was right there on the spot when it happened. And it led to just this extraordinary, riveting story that he told. And it goes from there. I mean, the other thing that I would say is, in case we don't come back to it, it was Dr. King's assassination and your mother's beautiful statement in the church during the ceremony here, when she realized that none of the photographers who were assigned to cover the event were African American, and that one who couldn't get in was Moneta Sleet, shooting for Ebony, I believe. And he was not able to get inside the church. And she said, if he doesn't get in, nobody gets in. And they let him in. And he positioned himself to the right of Mrs. King, and you were on her lap. You were leaning inside her. And he took the most extraordinary, gripping photograph of elegance in dire circumstances of the two of them. And though it was for a magazine, which meant normally it would not qualify for a Pulitzer Prize, because that's for newspapers, it got picked up by the wire services and got used in a lot of newspapers. And as a result of that, and as a result of what Mrs. King did, Moneta Sleet became the first African American to win the Pulitzer Prize for photography.
Mayor Franklin, I don't want to get into how old anybody is or was. But what about your recollection or your...
So I was in Atlanta. I was working for the U.S. Department of Labor, the main office, in an office called the Office of Contract Compliance, which was responsible for affirmative action, finding ways to get especially women and African Americans jobs at various companies that were doing federal business. And I had just graduated from college, so you now know how old I am. And they needed a woman on the team to travel to the South because they were giving dexterity exams to the women who would come in to get the jobs. So they invited me as the youngest member of the team to come. And we stopped in Atlanta because we were going to a small town, to a mill town. And we stopped in Atlanta, and mine is a very pedestrian program, and we were in a bar in the afternoon called the Birdcage. And I walked out, leaving my colleagues who were just having a good time, and walked to the restroom. And on the radio, the announcer said Dr. King had been killed. And I went back to the group and said, Dr. King has been killed. And they said, oh no, you just heard that. And as a result of that, I was able to stay for that entire week in Atlanta as the funeral was being planned and prepared. And I watched on Auburn Avenue, standing on something that was there, because I wasn't tall enough to see all of the people come through Auburn Avenue, down Auburn Avenue, Andrew Young and others, James Orange and others, and witnessed that firsthand just by chance. I knew that I needed to be in this place. I mean, we took vacation time for those worried about how federal dollars are spent. We took vacation time and spent an extra week here on our own so that we could be a part of the many people who came from all over the country and all over the world to celebrate Dr. King that week.
Now, I was having dinner at a restaurant talking about the Grand Dragon, the Ku Klux Klan. That was my dinner companion, by the way. And the maitre d' knew my relationship with the Kings, and she came and put a note on the table, and I ignored it because I'd heard before that, something had happened. She said, "Did you hear what happened to Dr. King?" And I hadn't heard anything. So I ignored the note. And she came back and she said, "I hate to disturb you, but I think you ought to just read the note." And on the note said, "Something has happened." And I decided to go to the telephone. And Mrs. King's private lines were busy, and that was unusual for all the lines to be busy. And I said, "I'd better go over." As I approached her house, she was backing out the driveway with Mayor Ivan Allen in the police car, and they were on the way to the airport. And she said, "Oh, I've been trying to reach you." And she said, "Will you, I've got to go to Memphis. Something has happened to Martin." And although she had a very good staff to take care of the children, she knew I had a special relationship to the children. And she said, "Would you stay with them?" And I said yes, and she backed out. Well, as we all now know, that she got to the airport and then got the news, because she didn't know what had really happened. She heard he had gotten shot, but she had not heard anything more detailed than that, and she was going to see for herself. Well, she got to the airport, and then they told her the news. She turned around and came back, and by that time, on that short distance of timing, the house just got filled with people who had heard the news. And she came in, and I'll never forget how she handled things. She spoke to everybody in the house. But Mrs. King was such a caring person, so sensitive to everybody, that she took time to say hello to everybody and thank them for being there. Then she said to her staff that she was going to go back to her bedroom, and she wanted to be alone, but she ordered them, "Do not tell my children anything. Do not go in the room. I will want to talk to my children myself." And ordered them to their bedrooms to stay. And she asked me to accompany her to her bedroom. And then telephone calls began to come in from everywhere. And she got calls. Can I tell this story? That I don't know what all I'm supposed to tell.
You got the microphone. Go ahead. Do whatever you want.
Okay. She got calls from everybody, and the staff would put the calls through, and I was to intercept for her. And we all recognized President Johnson's voice, and I would tell her, "This is the president." And so everybody said what we all do, like, "Oh, Mrs. King, I'm so sorry to hear the news, and if there's anything I can do, let me know." We all said that in a very caring way, but the one call that was different was Bobby Kennedy. His call came in a little later than most people's calls, and he never said, "If there's anything I can do." Here's what he said to her: "Mrs. King, we know there are a lot of things you need. One of them is pretty apparent, that you need more telephone lines. Because we've been trying to get you since the news broke, which was about 5 o'clock Atlanta time." And he said, "We've dispatched a man to come to Atlanta, and by midnight he will install enough telephone service in your home. And we also heard on the news that you plan to go back to Memphis to get your husband. And I've dispatched an airplane. It's at the airport now. It's there waiting for you at any point, at any time." Gave the tailgate number and gave the man's name, his phone number, all the information. The telephone is there. The plane is waiting whenever you want to go to Memphis. And then he asked who would be her main contact, and she said, "I would be representing her." And he put me on the line and said, "Zernona, call every hotel in Atlanta, talk to the management, and do not release any rooms until he hears from the rest of us." And he just rattled off all of these things that needed to be done. And he said, "And my staff is en route to Atlanta. We'll be there by 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." And when I did call the management the next morning and told everybody to hold the rooms. And then I said to people like Sidney Poitier and John Johnson, you know what Black Power is? I'm it. You know. I had control of all the hotel rooms in Atlanta.
So, Dr. King, obviously you were just a child at the time, but your reflections on that day.
Yeah, I feel a little out of place because I was 5 years old and totally oblivious to anything that was going on that particular day. Most of the stuff, you know, I've been predominantly told. So when she got back from the airport, I was asleep. My siblings, actually, Martin and Yolanda, actually saw the news when the shooting took place, but they didn't know that he had died. So when it came time well, actually my sister ran out of the room and said, don't tell me, don't tell me. And when she finally got back in the room, and I don't know if this was before or after she got back from the airport, and it probably was after, she she told my mother that she was you know, your mommy, you're very strong. I don't know if I could do it. And she asked the question about, should I hate the man who killed my father? And my mother said, Daddy wouldn't want you to do that. And so it wasn't until the next day. I don't want to take us to the next day, but since you said we have the mic, I'll take it. It wasn't until the next day when they were bringing the body back that my mother realized she needed to explain to me what had happened, because eventually I was going to see his body laid out in a casket at the funeral home. And so when we got to the airport and went up to get on the plane, she began to explain it to me, that your father is dead. He's laid out in a casket. He won't be able to talk to you. And his spirit has gone on to live with God. Of course, you know, I don't know what that means, but what I do remember is that, you know, we used to have, obviously, I remember all of the dinner table time. And so I wanted to know how he would eat. And in her recent book, My Life, My Love, My Legacy, she says, I thought about telling her angel food, which of course would have been a crazy explanation, but she didn't really say anything. But I did inquire about that because I remember vividly being at the dinner table with my father quite a bit. But those are, I apologize.
Ambassador Young, this recollection and this question I think is probably hardest for you. I mean, after all, you were there. But put us there. Take us to that day and let us know what we need to know.
Well, I think that I almost have to go back to the Poor People's Campaign itself, because none of us wanted the Poor People's Campaign. I mean, Martin Luther King had been actively involved almost every day of his life. He'd been threatened, he'd been stabbed, he'd been jailed, his home had been bombed. The worst experience, I think, was being arrested in DeKalb County and taken in chains down to Reidsville. And I think that night in 1960 was probably the night that he decided that his days were numbered. And he made jokes about it. And he was always talking about death, but never about his own death. He would always talk about one of us, and then he'd preach our funerals. But he would say a couple of things that you should remember. That one, death is the ultimate democracy. You're gonna die, and it doesn't matter when. You don't have anything to say about when you're gonna die, where you're gonna die, how you're gonna die. Your only decision is what is it you give your life for? And you have to make that decision every day of your life. And he was very conscious of that, because from the time that he won the Nobel Prize, his life was under constant threat. And we think of the FBI as a friend and an ally now. And it was then at the lower levels, at the levels of people we dealt with. But J. Edgar Hoover had a sick problem that he just became enraged when Martin won the Nobel Prize. And we were in Bimini writing the speech, and there are no phones in Bimini and in Bahamas. And all of a sudden we looked up and there were helicopters coming, and all of the networks were sending their, and we didn't know why. And it was because Hoover had lashed out at Martin. And he realized then, I think, that, well, I don't know, that this was something that he was going to have to cope with all of the rest of his life. And, but he finished his Nobel Prize speech. He went to visit after the Nobel Prize. Well, let me go to his going to President Johnson. And his life had a sense of urgency almost from that point on. And he didn't, I mean, Ralph Abernathy used to say that Martin had a war against sleep. He said, you got a war on poverty, but he got a war against sleep. He doesn't ever want to sleep. He's always up reading and talking and walking the floor, calling people from different time zones. And that it was almost like every day he lived it like it might be his last. So we'd kind of gotten used to that, and we were trying to calm him down and trying to get him, because if there was one thing that he had dreamed of, I think, as a young man, was that he might get to, when he got to preach at Riverside Church, he was really thrilled that that was a high point in his life, as much, if not more, than a Nobel Prize. He was offered a job by one of the deacons in the church. They needed an interim pastor. And we tried to convince him to, at 38, to take a year or two in sabbatical, come back after the election, and, you know, it wouldn't be wasted time. He'd have a pulpit. He'd be teaching a whole new generation of young preachers. And that, and the offer was actually made to him, and he turned it down. And we thought he was crazy, and told him so, you know. And that, but we were tired. And I used to say, yeah, I know. Jose had been in a foxhole, and a direct hit had killed everybody in the foxhole but him. And he kept wondering, figured he was saved to die for civil rights, because when he came back, they beat him up at a water fountain as a veteran on crutches in uniform. And so I said, you know, you just want to, I mean, you want to die. You don't have to rush it. You know, yeah, there's a cross for you, but, you know, I'm not looking for my cross. And neither was Dr. King. But he had this thing about the least of these. And that God is going to ask you about, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you heal the sick? Did you set at liberty those who are oppressed? And he was always mindful of that. And it was as though he had set aside this movement to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of race, war, and poverty. And we had done much toward race and war, but we had not done anything toward poverty. And that's the thing we have to realize now. Most of the things that we call race problems are really the effects of the difference between haves and have-nots, including the racism and insecurity of white people. And he understood that then. And so when we had the Poor People's Campaign meet at Pascal's in early January of that year, the group was almost a third white. I mean, we had several white organizations from Appalachia, you know, the welfare movements. We had Hispanic, 3 or 4 different Hispanic movements, Cesar Chavez and Corky Gonzalez, Rios Tijerina, plus all of the civil rights organizations. This was a compulsion for him. He had to get this on record, and it was though he felt like, I think, he didn't have long, and he didn't know how long, but that was an urgent sense that none of us shared. And he really got mad and kind of cussed us out one day. I mean, he didn't use profanity, but it was worse than profanity. Because he called you by name, and he showed and he illustrated where we had let him down. And this was after he had been to Memphis once. But once he went, we had to go back. So we were pretty much united in his going back. And that was it. But once we got there, we found a lot of things that he had not anticipated. We found a group of young people who said they had been paid to disrupt the march. Who paid them, I don't know. But they said that they were encouraged to do this and receive money. The Memphis police moved him out of the corner room where he would have been safe for us, and said they didn't want him on the ground floor, that they wanted him up where they could protect him better. Well, we were not worried about that, but that last day I had been in the courtroom all day long, and we had won the case. But when I came back, he was probably happier than I'd seen him in years. In fact, I don't know if I've ever seen him acting that crazy and foolish and full of life and fun. I mean, he was just it was joy bubbling over, and he was picking on me and everybody else that crossed his path. But I talked back to him, and he threw a pillow at me, and I threw it back, and then everybody picked up pillows, and I mean, they were like a bunch of 10-year-olds. And then there was a knock at the door. And Billy Kyle said, "Look, my wife's got dinner on the table. You all are running late." And he stopped immediately and said, "Let me put on my shirt and tie, and I'll be ready in 5 minutes." When he came out of the room, dressed, the night before, he had literally had a fever. He'd been sweating. And we didn't want him to go to the mass meeting. But when we got there, and this church that seats 11,000 was full, and with people all out in the street in the rain, Ralph said, "Go get Martin. They came here to see him." And that's when he made that "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. But the next day was one of the most joyful days I'd ever seen him. And until he went to his room and came out. And I was telling him, you better get a coat because it's cool out here. And it was as though he lifted his head to see what the weather was like. I don't know whether I need a coat. And a shot rang out. I don't think he heard the shot. I don't think he felt anything. It immediately severed his spinal cord. And I was mad. But I was mad at him. And it's hard to explain, but I said, damn you, you're going to heaven and leaving us in hell. And I realize now that he didn't go anywhere. That everything that happened here not only did he inspire, but he never believed that death was the end, that there is life beyond death. And that's why he was never afraid to die. And it's why he could joke with us about our deaths. But his grandmother had helped him to deal with death. My grandmother was blind from 80 to 86, and I had to read the Bible and the newspaper, and every day she prayed to die. And death was her hope and salvation. And she'd fuss with God about leaving her here too long. And that's the same sort of spirit I thought you got from Martin, but he would never say that because he would never want to run away from what he felt was his earthly duty and responsibility. But it was to be with the least of these, God's children. And against all of our advice, he insisted on going to Memphis with the sanitation workers.
I just wanted to add this little tidbit. If you listen to his last words, and you think about the fact that on, I think it was around March 12th, he sent my mother some flowers. We still have those flowers. They were artificial flowers. And she thought it was rather strange. She asked him when he got home to get his bag to leave. I think he was going on a rest break or something. Why did you give me the artificial flowers? He said, I wanted you to have something that you can keep. It's as if he had a premonition of what was getting ready to happen. I don't think it's an irony that the night before his assassination, he talked about going to that mountaintop and looking over and seeing the promised land. And then when he said, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, I know people who are biblical scholars can understand what that really means when you search the scriptures. I think he had some encounter that none of us will ever know about. And if you look in his eyes, you can tell he was not here in that speech. Just look again at that speech. When he starts talking about going up to the mountain and looking over, his eyes turn a different way than I've ever seen them. So I think he had a premonition. I think he was preparing all of you all. Probably couldn't tell everybody exactly.
Ms. Clayton, you have some perspectives on the immediate aftermath, being with the family and as the funeral preparations were made here in Atlanta. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I first want to give the proper credit to Mrs. King. At a moment like this, she had such strength, and there were so many decisions to be made, and people were giving her advice. And the one thing, she was a very decisive woman. She followed her own intuitions, so she made her own decisions, which I really applauded her for. But what was interesting about that, I want to talk about the fact that when she said she thought she'd go to Memphis and she thought she'd help lead the march, there were a lot of things that she had expressed, and I personally wanted her to be prepared clothes-wise to meet all of her engagements, all the things she wanted to do. And I went downtown to a store that's not there anymore now, but it was a small boutique that had very good quality clothing. And I told the man that I've come to get some clothes for Mrs. King. I had no money, and I certainly didn't want to bother her for any credit cards or anything, but I said, I want to pick some things that I think she would like and let me take them home to her, and then whatever she liked we'd keep, and I'd come back and pay. Well, I picked lots of things and brought them home, and surprisingly, Mrs. King approved of all the things I had brought. When I came into their home, in the foyer of the home were two men who were very close to Dr. King, Harry Belafonte and Stan Levinson. They both were men of means, and they said, "Gee, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm bringing all these clothes because I want Mrs. King to look good, be prepared, and not have to worry about, what to wear." And I said, "But I had no money. I brought all these clothes, but I owe this man all this money in case she keeps them." Well, when we settled down at the end of the evening, she and I would always talk about what was on her schedule. And so we looked at the clothes, and she made a decision that she would keep them. Now, those men said to me, "We want the same thing for Mrs. King. So whatever these clothes cost, here are credit cards," and each of them gave me a credit card and told me to cover the cost, whatever it was. When I came back the next day and said, we kept the clothes, and I've come now to settle my bill. And he said, "You've got a zero balance." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm white in America, and I have to feel like I have to assume some responsibility and some guilt for creating an environment that would cause this kind of ending for Dr. King. So the least I can do is cover the cost of these clothing. So it costs us nothing." But Mrs. King was concerned each hour of the day about the children. She was so organized in her head. She was concerned about the house running well, the children being comfortable, and she was prepared with all the questions that were coming her way. And one of the things, the Constitution, I was very, very close to Ralph McGill, who was the publisher at that time. And he got a call from Mr. Nixon, not president. He wasn't president at the time. I guess he had won the party's nomination, I suppose. I think it was. And he called Mr. McGill and asked could he come to see Mrs. King, that he knew how Dr. King had felt about, politics and especially him, but wanted to know could he and Mrs. Nixon come and call on her. Well, there were people in the house who said, "No, he's just coming for politics." And Mr. McGill said, "I don't know what the situation is, but I have a very good friend who's with her, and I'll ask her to find out." So I told Mrs. King that about the call from Mr. McGill. And that night, with discussion of some of the people who were there, and in some other close associates, had yes, no, whether we should let him come or not. And so when they all left, she said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I don't think this is a time for politics, but it's your call. But if we give him some parameters, I think it could work." And I said, "We can't be sure there's no entourage, no press, no hullabaloo about his coming, and see what he says to that." So we called Mr. McGill back, and so she said, "Well, let's try that." So I called Mr. McGill back and said, "We've got some restrictions that we'd like to impose on it." And he said it didn't matter, that he and Mrs. Nixon wanted very much to come. "We'll come in anyway." She would agree to do it, and she agreed. Well, we came in to the residence in a very simple car. I don't want to offend anybody, but I don't know cars well, but it was like a Pontiac. Excuse me. I don't know what kind of car, but it was a beige car coming up with no press. And he came back to Mrs. King and said that at the last minute, Mrs. Nixon had gotten a call from New York. One of the girls got sick and she wasn't able to come. But he said, we just felt like we wanted to call on you personally. And then he added to Mrs. King, we are so sorry about what happened and we feel some responsibility. So the two of us, talking about him and his wife, he pulled a check out of his pocket, an envelope, I should say. I didn't see the check, but an envelope that said that we were trying to decide what we wanted to do to express our grief. And we have gone to the bank, and we have money in the bank to cover education for all 4 of your children whenever that time comes. And as Bernice just said, she was 4 or 5, and whatever their ages were, they knew there was a long way, and for some of them, especially Bernice, but that's our contribution. I don't think Mrs. King ever used it, but anyway, he did that, and he left as quietly as he entered. And she made all of these decisions with such calmness, such deliberateness. I messed that up good. But deliberately, she just went step by step on all the things that she was facing. And I had traveled with her before this on our concert tours and saw her sense of organization. And I was impressed by that. But I've never seen such an organized woman as she was during those turbulent time in her life. And there was so many things that were going on. And the one thing that was really difficult for her was on the day of the national viewing, the public viewing, I should say. It was scheduled, I think, for like 10 in the morning till all day on the campus of the universities over there, the Black colleges. And then they were going to move him to Ebenezer at midnight. But at that time in the morning when she was to go over to the chapel where the viewings take place, she was busy at Ebenezer putting finishing touches to the program. And when the security guards called and said, Mrs. King, it's raining, and these people, there must be thousands of people here lined up waiting to get in. What must we do because it's raining? And so she was so passionate. She said, oh, well, why don't you let him in? Then I whispered to her, you know, you should see him first. And I said, the public will wait. And so they finally decided that. And again, I saw her with her consideration for other people. She lived like that every day, and she acted like that at a moment when she was obviously, you know, pained to the core for what was facing her. But I saw so many wonderful things that to me added to the sincerity and the strength of this woman.
Can I just mention that you really need to get her new book, My Life, Love, and Legacy, because in it, she talked about coming home from her church choir practice and finding her house burned down when she was about 15, and that her father had them to pray, first of all, to thank God that none of them were home, and so all of them were alive. And then he asked them to pray for the sick people who burned their house down. And then he prayed for them that they would have no bitterness. And I tell that story because that was at least a dozen years before she even knew Martin Luther King. So there was this nonviolent, forgiving, courageous tradition that she grew up with in Marion, Alabama. And so it was as though Well, we both used to say that, you know, if we had not married, well, she'd say, if he'd married any of the girls he'd been going with in Boston, you never would have heard his name.
But you know, Andy,
and of course, my wife would say the same thing about me.
Well, you know, there was a conversation, as a matter of fact, I met the woman. There were people who had kind of decided who was going to, you know, get Dr. King, Martin Luther King, as the man of choice. And he would always brag about all the women, you know, who were really after him. But that's what men do. They all do that. But
didn't nobody want me?
Yeah. But you know, I'm convinced that Dr. King made the right choice. I don't think any woman could have handled her life in any fashion similarly to what Mrs. King had to do.
You know, it's connected. Marion is 30 miles from Selma. And it's as though, I mean, I see all of this as the hand of God moving in his life long before he was aware of it. And that all of us, and I don't want us to forget that everything that has happened in Atlanta, everything, see, has direct roots in the teaching and the preaching and the living and forgiving that Martin Luther King brought to this city. And he left it with all of us. And the visions that have made this city real, black and white, he was always a part of. And I always give credit to Coca-Cola because they stood up when there were people who actually wanted to boycott the dinner for the Nobel Prize. And J. Paul Austin said, oh no, we cannot do that. Coca-Cola cannot be in a city that doesn't honor a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And there were times throughout his life and ministry that he was preparing us. And I think the fact that Ivan Allen was right there with Coretta almost from the very minute that he heard it, and Mr. Woodruff, and they just rolled out they took charge of the affairs for the city. And I don't care what you see, we wouldn't have 6 million people here now. We wouldn't have had the Olympics. We wouldn't have had that airport. We wouldn't have had anything had it not been for the kind of relationship. And let me make it a relationship because there were 3 generations of kings that knew each other. And there were 3 generations of Ivan Allens that had been together before Martin. And so there was something about this city that I think produced him, and it couldn't have been done without the collection of colleges and universities that have made us where we are. The heart of Atlanta, and I didn't go to one of them, but the heart of Atlanta and the brains of Atlanta is all coming out of that AU Center. And we shouldn't, I mean, his mother and his grandma, I mean, everybody went to Spelman. I mean, you had great women coming out of there and great men coming out of Morehouse.
But Andy, also, you know, the city just showed such leadership. I was told that when people came, there's so many people came, everybody came to Atlanta, and the white churches downtown even let their fellowship halls, just turn them into bedrooms and kitchens and fed people. And Mary Allen, I understand, said to the airport, if people are coming for the funeral, don't charge them any food. People ate free during those days when they came here for the funeral. That Atlanta stood up, although they wanted to deny him the dinner for the having won the prize, it showed its beautiful spirit at his death that there were people here from all over the world, all kinds of people from every section of the world came here for that funeral. And the city we were the only city that didn't have that turbulence that a lot of cities faced during that funeral period.
So we don't have too much time left in the audience. We promised we would take some questions from the audience. So I'll throw one out there, and whoever wants to grab it while folks come to ask their questions. There's a microphone over here, I think, right? I know this is not easy to do, but project Dr. King into our world today. Were he still here, what would be his cause? Where would he be? What would he be doing? From anyone who wants to take that one.
Well, first place, if he were here, it wouldn't be like this.
Kevin, I'd like to pick up on something very, very quickly. Pick up on something that Ambassador Young said a little bit earlier, and he may well disagree with me after I phrase it this way. But to me, the essence of Dr. King's life was a belief in a Christian doctrine of love.
Very much so.
And never let anyone drag you so low as to hate. Always distinguish between the evil deed and the evil doer. So in our present political context, I would like to assert that Martin Luther King Jr. would tell you to reject, totally reject, giving in to the politics of hate.
Amen.
Anybody else?
I would just add that I think one of the strengths of Atlanta, in addition to the history, is that people like those who are sitting around here and out in the audience stayed in Atlanta. And so there's been this continuity of the experiences with Dr. King and with the civil rights movement, and the stories get told and retold so new generations can hear them and can be a part of the celebration of his life and legacy in very real ways. People who come to Atlanta and have a chance to just bump into, I'm not talking about myself, but any one of these folks sitting on the stage, they're amazed at how accessible those who are involved, who know the stories, still are. And I think that makes a difference.
Can I add that to your point? And we have to keep telling those stories over and over again. I mean, just following up on what you remembered about the Nobel Prize, and some of you may know all of this, that the Atlanta community, President Mays of Morehouse, Benjamin Mays and Bishop Hallinan, and Rabbi Rothschild and Ralph McGill came together to try to have a dinner to honor Dr. King in 1965 for the Nobel Peace Prize, and the Atlanta business community was supposed to get behind it. And a couple of weeks before it's supposed to take place, the New York Times runs a story, and it's only about this big on page 1 before it jumps to the inside, that says that ticket sales have tanked, that they're not selling tickets, that the business community is not getting behind this dinner for Dr. King. And this is very embarrassing to some members of the business community. And to what the ambassador said, that's when Paul Austin and Ivan Allen go down to the plantation Ishiway, and they meet with Robert Woodruff, and they told him the problem. And he said, well, here's what I'd like you to do. And he gives them some marching orders. And they come back and they have a meeting at the Piedmont Driving Club with all these members of the business community. And they said, well, just want you to know that we're disappointed in the chairman. Mr. Woodruff is disappointed in the ticket sales, and that he just wants you to know that Coca-Cola is an international company, and it can be headquartered anywhere in the world it wants to be. and 50 years after that dinner, you were here. We on this stage showed the video from that dinner that was phenomenal. It was the first time it had ever been seen, of black and white seated together at this dinner, and everyone who was on the dais. It was just a beautiful evening. So thank you for that.
And I just wanted to add, because I know we have some questions. I think two things. One, he said to us that we needed to immediately study nonviolence in every field of human conflict, including conflict between nations. I think in line with what David said, he would continue to be pressing us about embracing that whole philosophy and methodology of nonviolence. The second thing is, he talked about, and where do we go from here, chaos of community, having a revolution of values. We have yet to have the revolution of values where people become the center and not things and profit. And so I think he would still be pushing that same message in this climate.
You know, you know what, when we talk about this celebration and commemoration for this year, even if you didn't know the man, you'd have to ask, what kind of man was this? Do you realize when you celebrate 50 years after the death, some people can't remember people were buried last month. Once you're dead, you're gone, and people forget you. We are remembering him, and I even said to you, Mr. Rowley, that I feel that Dr. King, and sometimes I'll talk in the present tense like he said this, as if he were really still here, because to me he still is. He will never die. His life was so marvelous and so revolutionary, I would say, that and admirable, that we will never forget this man and what a contribution he made. So it's only appropriate that we celebrate him every year.
I don't know how much time we'll have for how many questions, but go ahead.
Hello, my name is Javier Thompson, and I've created a platform called Vibrant Sons that is a platform for many men and women who have grown up without their fathers in their lives, and gives them a space to share their stories in hopes of inspiring others and finding personal, strength. So my question was for Dr. Bernice King was, we talk so much about Dr. Martin Luther King and his death and how his legacy has affected all of us. But what unique challenges did you have to face and overcome mourning your father's death in such a public space?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. We took our clues from the way my mother dealt with it. My mother was very stoic. I never really saw her cry. And I think that's part of the reason why part of my posture has been that way through the years. It's only been probably in the last maybe 5 years, or maybe even since my mother passed, that I started to delve more into, my own emotional journey. Because I've been through a journey. I've been through a journey where I literally hated white people, especially white males. And I had to be healed from that. Now, the public didn't know that, and people even close to me didn't know it, because the way I was taught and brought up, I was able to shroud it. But I had to be healed. When you talk about hate being too great a burden to bear, it's very much too much a greater burden to bear. Being able to have moments. The hardest thing for me every year is this moment. Because and I've said this recently, just being transparent, I'm still struggling with having to share my parents publicly. Not just my dad, but my mom, because I lost all of that. I mean, I didn't get to do the girl things that a daughter does with her mom because of the work that she continued to carry on. And so I'm struggling with that now. When I see everything going on and everybody celebrating him, I appreciate it, but I also struggle with, but it's my dad. If I can just be frank and honest. And although I have that internal struggle, and I'm working through it because I'm 50, almost 55 now next week, I tell people that if I had to have it any other way, I would want the story to still be the same. Because my personal burden, my personal emotional state is something that I will work through, but our world is better off because of the journey that he and my parents took.
Thank you so much.
My name is Khalid. I am one of the organizers of the Atlanta chapter of Black Lives Matter. last year I ran for office. I came out of the street and I became the first Black Lives Matter organizer elected to public office. I'm a councilman in the city of South Fulton. One of the things that we did when we organized the Atlanta chapter, one of the first things we did was have an intergenerational dialogue with members of SNCC, including Congressman Lewis. And the question I posed to you all as a group is the same question I posed to them, because I know that there's always been a generational conflict between the next generation of leaders and the last generation of leaders. And I know that one day, right now, I'm a feisty young councilman that's like doing too much and I need to slow down. But there's a generation of people coming behind me and they're like, y'all are doing too much, y'all need to slow down.
You can't do too much.
Thank you. And so my question is, how do we get better at passing the baton and building that pipeline of leadership?
Let me say that my lesson from my father was, don't ever lose your temper in a fight. Anger kills you, not anybody else. When you lose your temper and get angry, the blood runs from your head and you do something stupid. Don't get mad, get smart. Everything you do, and you can't do too much, but think it through before you do it and know the implications of what you're doing. And, you know, and if he also said that if you haven't found something you're willing to die for, you're probably not fit to live anyway. So, I mean, and that doesn't mean an office. He never held an office. I never wanted to hold an office. I think that the saints, well, let me just say right now, we're about to pass on one of the real female saints of our time. That's a lady by the name of Rita Samuels, who's moving into hospice today. Oh, and she was one who helped us elect Jimmy Carter, and who went into the state capitol and looked around and said, I don't see no black folks pictures up here. And Governor Carter said, well, you decide how to do it. You know, the numbers are waning. And so we need strong minds and courageous hearts to carry on. God bless you.
And just to specifically, I'm not in their generation. I'm close to their generation. But in all seriousness, you know, I think you can learn a lot from Dr. King's leadership. One of the things that always surprises me when I hear people in the generation just slightly below me or behind me, is that, you know, this is our movement. This is not your granddaddy's movement or something like that, or we're decentralized. There's no leadership. You know, I always say there has to be a leadership protocol. Even nature has a leadership protocol. And even if you have a bunch of leaders, there still has to be some kind of pecking order to decisions, whatever that is, in the leadership protocol. But more importantly, Dr. King, and this is something I want you to share with your generation, Dr. King was a leader among leaders. Because we keep saying, well, we don't have just one leader. They didn't have just, it's evident from what they have done and held things to be able to have something to pass to your generation that you would not have had if they were not leaders. And so in your generation, I think the most important thing is understanding people's strength and knowing how to plug them in and bringing along people that are younger than you to work with you and side by side. That part of leadership is, you know, mentorship and having them with you in what you're doing so that it can be passed off and it can be a smooth transition. Now, Mayor Young could speak more to that, because I think a large part of what has happened in our city has a lot to do with that in terms of some of the mayoral leadership we've had from generation to generation. So that's what I would say. Just remember that he was around leaders and he understood their strengths. He knew when an Andy was needed. to be dispatched versus a Hosea needed to be dispatched. Yeah. So knowing each other is important, and recognizing and giving respect to people in their lane, and everybody not trying to be in the same lane, because that's important as well.
I just want to thank you all for this. I feel like I'm on hollow ground right now. My name is Kipper Jones. I'm nowhere near as distinguished as these gentlemen, but I'm just a singer-songwriter. Who cares? Ambassador Young, I guess this question is probably for you. In regards to the Poor People's Campaign, which was Dr. King's final mission, as you kind of spoke to, that's where we were when he left here. Was there any sort of, and I kind of understand the pitting against like poor whites against blacks and that whole economic sort of separation, at least I'm not black, but kind of thing. But was there ever any direction as to, or succession plan as to what would happen? You said, he kind of knew. And
well, so we made a decision, or he made a decision, that Ralph Abernathy, who had actually been maybe the front runner for the leadership in Montgomery, and who moved aside rather than have a fuss between the Baptist and the Methodist leadership, and they all got behind young 26-year-old Martin Luther King. And if Ralph had not done that, I think we would not have had the movement we had. Because remember, Martin Luther King got kicked out of the National Baptist Convention. I mean, he was not respected or loved, or, I mean, he used to tell a joke about, he used to joke about being stabbed, and all the preachers gathered around, and he said it was like he had an out-of-body experience, and he was up there in the room, and all of these guys were praying, and he said, I wanted to tell them, y'all don't get too happy, I ain't gone yet. And it's well.
I mean, one of my favorite parts of that last speech was where he says, I may not get there with you, but you will. So, I mean, this incredible faith that other people were going to be able to carry on his legacy, to me is one of, it's humbling in lots of ways, because he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, he's an incredible leader, he's recognized around the world, but he says, without me, you will get there.
Can I just say that one of the people we often overlook was Jimmy Carter. That Jimmy Carter always knew that he would not have been able to be governor of Georgia, much less president, if it had not been for Martin Luther King. And it was his relationship to Daddy King and the Reverend Fred C. Bennett that kind of saved his presidency. His campaign. But we should remember that for the 4 years that he was president, no American soldier was killed in battle, and no American soldier killed anybody. And he practiced what I call the politics of respect. He sent me to Africa to ask African leaders what we could do. What is it you expect of this administration, and how can we help you with what you want to do? And I think that is the most nonviolent approach that I think a president of these United States has ever taken toward the rest of the world. And almost everything that people asked, the Israelis didn't want to bother with Egypt anymore. And Egypt didn't want any more parts of Israel. But they could not get together. He got them together. When Roosevelt went to Panama, Panama said, look, we don't want to destroy the canal. We just want some respect and run it with you. And we can do that in a treaty. So we had a treaty with Panama. The Russians wanted to they realized that all of these missiles are terribly dangerous. And they wanted to have an arms limitation treaty. And he heard that, and we did it. But he was able to do it largely because it was what people who had been enemies wanted to do with us. So the enemies of the United States of America all over the world suddenly became friends.
Hi, my name is Reagan Edwards, and I've been inspired as well. I'm running for HD 37. And my question, though, is Dr. King inspired so many people, and he caused a true movement that all of our movements are, trying to imitate. What nugget was it? I know it was him and probably the blessing of God on his life, but what, if you could give me one just phrase or statement that can help inspire millennials like myself. I might be the oldest millennial living, but millennials like myself and those younger to get out and vote. I mean,
no, but you got to remember, he went to Morehouse College. He went to Crozier Theological Seminary. He got a PhD from Boston University. He had a nearly photographic mind, and he worked 18 hours a day, period. You do that, something's going to happen.
I think we probably have time for one more question, then we're going to have to wrap it
Hello,
up.
Pelham. My name is John Means. I am so honored to see this group of folks, and I just wanted to share with you that I moved 2,500 miles to move here. Consciously, I was already successful as a young man, but I came here because at 14 years old, I came to Atlanta the first time for Martin's funeral. Dr. King was a hero for my family. Even back then, we had 3 pictures that weren't us. It was Dr. King and the Kennedys, okay? And our house wasn't the only house like that. Growing up in the South. So I've been lucky enough to go around the world in business travels. And one of the things I have gained from that is the entire world looks at Atlanta for leadership in race relations and how to successfully move the ball forward collectively and make things work.
Well, let me just cut you off and say none of us were lucky. Luck hasn't got nothing to do with it. We've been blessed, and don't forget it.
I completely agree with that.
To those to whom much has been given, of them will much be required. It's not suggested, it's not expected, it's required. Do something, pass on your blessings, or get the hell out of here.
And I think that answers my next question.
You can quote me on that.
How do we pass it on?
All right. Now,
to the next generation.
No. To this generation. We don't have to wait another generation. Things are bad today, in case you hadn't
noticed. Let me just say this. I always say that people often ask, well, where's the next Martin Luther King coming from? But I say, well, what's wrong with you? You know, if each of us took the responsibility inside of our souls to plan our lives the way Dr. King did, as Andrew Young has said, you know, Dr. King practiced what he preached. He meant it and he lived it. And each of us can do something. Do you know we still have, she said, feed the hungry. We still have hungry people. Clothe the naked. We still got naked people. You've got to feel the spirit inside of you that makes you and compels you to do for others. And that's where the life and the world will be better.
And with that, please join me in a great round of applause for our panel.